The wind screaming through the jagged spires of the Frost Peak stronghold was bitter enough to freeze a man's lungs, but Lunar Queen Morana did not shiver. She stood on the high stone balcony overlooking the expansive courtyard, her hands gripping the frozen iron railing so tightly her knuckles were white. She wore a heavy cloak of white winterfox fur over her dark leather armor, her posture as rigid and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded her domain. But internally, the fierce, brilliant tactician was fighting a suffocating, losing battle. Since the death of her mate 3 winters ago, the patriarchal council of elders had been relentlessly tightening the noose around her reign. They did not care that Morana had successfully commanded the Pack's armies, or that she had doubled their winter grain reserves through brilliant trade negotiations. To the archaic, deeply traditional elders of Frostpeak, a Pack without an Alpha King was an intolerable vulnerability. They had cornered her, using the threat of a civil schism to force her hand into hosting the Alpha trials. Below her in the courtyard, servants were hurriedly hanging banners and preparing the grounds for the arrival of the suitors. To the Pack, it was a grand, historic gathering. To Morana, it was a gathering of vultures. She knew exactly what these rival warlords wanted. They didn't want a mate. They wanted her highly trained army, they wanted her impregnable fortress, and they wanted the absolute authority of the Frost Peak crown. But worst of all, Morana knew exactly how they viewed her greatest treasure. Deep in the shadows of the stronghold's lower levels, far away from the political venom of the high balconies, the rhythmic clank squeak of heavy iron echoed through the hay-strewn corridors of the royal stables. Prince Fenrin, the 8-year-old heir to the Frost Peak throne, navigated the uneven dirt floor with practiced, exhausting effort. He had been born with a severely malformed right leg, twisted at the calf, and entirely incapable of supporting his weight without the heavy, articulated iron brace strapped around his thigh and shin. To the brutal, traditionalist warriors of the Pack, the boy was a walking tragedy, a weakness that tainted the royal bloodline. They looked at him with pity, or worse, with barely concealed disgust. They were all completely blind. What Fenrin lacked in physical agility, he possessed in a razor-sharp, deeply analytical mind. At 8 years old, he could read the complex topographical war maps in his mother's study faster than her seasoned generals. He possessed a gentle, fiercely empathetic heart that absorbed the world around him, and he knew exactly who in the stronghold saw him as a prince and who saw him as a problem. That was why Fenrin spent his time in the dirt and shadows of the stables. "You're making the back legs too long, Cade," Fenrin said, leaning heavily against a wooden support beam. He was looking down at a large, quiet man sitting on an overturned barrel in the darkest corner of the stable. Cade did not look like a man who belonged in the royal keep, even as a servant. He was broad-shouldered and heavily muscled, dressed in rough, unbleached linen and worn leather that was stained with horse oil and dirt. His arms and neck were covered in a roadmap of faded, jagged scars that spoke of a profoundly violent past he never discussed. He was the lowest-ranking stable hand in the fortress, a man who slept in the hay and shoveled manure. But Fenrin was not afraid of him. In fact, Cade was the only male in the entire Pack who didn't look at Fenrin's iron brace with pity. Cade paused his carving knife. He held up the small block of pine wood, inspecting the rudimentary shape of a running wolf. He blew a curl of wood shaving from the blade and looked at the boy. His eyes were a dark, stormy gray, infinitely deep and intensely quiet. "Wolves need long back legs to clear the snowdrifts in the high passes, little lord," Cade replied, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "If the legs are too short, they sink. They get stuck." "Then they should build better roads," Fenrin countered, a brilliant, cheeky smile breaking across his pale face. Cade's stoic expression softened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the closest the scarred man ever came to a smile. "Maybe when you are king, you can order the snow to stop falling." What Fenrin did not know, what no one in the Frost Peak Pack knew, was that the quiet, brooding stable boy was a walking apocalypse. Cade was a lone wolf, a survivor of a forgotten, blood-soaked history. Beneath his rough linen shirt and his submissive, silent demeanor, Cade harbored a massive, dormant Lycan-level alpha aura. It was a terrifying, suffocatingly heavy gravity that he spent every waking second of his life relentlessly suppressing, burying it so deep inside his chest that it registered as nothing more than a strange, heavy stillness to the wolves around him. He had come to Frost Peak to disappear, to live in the dirt and be forgotten by the world. But the disabled, brilliant little prince had somehow crawled past his massive defenses. Cade would carve the boy toys, listen to his strategic prattle about war maps, and quietly, fiercely position himself between the boy and any danger in the courtyard. The heavy, echoing blast of the stronghold's iron war horns suddenly shattered the quiet of the stables. Fenrin jumped, his hand instinctively grabbing the wooden beam for support as his iron brace clanked against the dirt. The alpha candidates had arrived. Cade stood up from the barrel. The movement was entirely silent, devoid of the heavy, clumsy footsteps of a normal servant. He slipped the wooden wolf and the carving knife into his pocket, moving to the massive, open stable doors. Fenrin limped quickly to his side, peeking around Cade's broad, protective silhouette to look out into the main courtyard. The heavy iron portcullis was raised, and a procession of rival warlords and their elite guards rode into the Frost Peak stronghold. They were draped in expensive furs, polished steel armor, and arrogant, preening pride. At the absolute front of the vanguard rode Lord Draken. He was a massive, cruel-looking man, sitting atop a heavily armored black warhorse. Draken was the primary alpha candidate, the warlord of the neighboring Ashen Valley territory, and the man the corrupt council elders were secretly backing for the throne. He possessed a brutal, unforgiving worldview, firmly believing that empathy was a disease and that a pack was only as strong as its capacity for violence. Draken pulled his massive warhorse to a halt in the center of the courtyard. He dismounted, his heavy steel boots striking the cobblestones with a deafening ring. He did not look at the welcoming servants. He looked directly up at the high balcony, his eyes locking onto Queen Morana. A dark, predatory smirk curled across his lips. It was the look of a man who was not looking at a prospective mate, but at a prize he was about to forcefully conquer. Then Draken's gaze drifted downward. He scanned the courtyard, his eyes sweeping over the architecture, the guards, and the lower levels, evaluating the assets he intended to steal. His gaze paused on the open stable doors. He saw the ragged stable hand standing in the shadows, and then he saw the small, pale boy standing beside him, leaning heavily on a squeaking iron brace. Draken's smirk instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated disgust. He turned to his lieutenant, an equally cruel-looking warrior at his side, and spoke. He did not yell, but he intentionally pitched his voice just loud enough for the enhanced hearing of the wolves around him to catch every venomous syllable. A beautiful, defensible territory, Draken sneered, stripping off his heavy leather riding gloves. It is a profound shame about the broken legacy that taints it. Such a fragile, crippled thing has no place in a true pack. He handed his gloves to a trembling servant. No matter, we will cleanse the bloodline of its weaknesses once the crown is mine. Up on the balcony, Morana's grip on the iron railing tightened until the metal groaned, her maternal fury warring with her political captivity. But down in the shadows of the stables, a much darker, infinitely more dangerous reaction occurred. Fenrin shrank back, his small hands gripping Cade's rough linen shirt, his eyes dropping to the dirt in shame. Cade did not look at the boy. His dark, stormy grey eyes remained locked entirely on Lord Draken. For a fraction of a microsecond, the absolute, flawless control Cade maintained over his biology slipped. A wave of terrifying, glacial pressure leaked from the stable hand's chest. The air in the stable instantly dropped 10 degrees. The massive warhorses in the stalls suddenly panicked, kicking at their enclosures in blind, biological terror. Draken's own horse threw its head back, pulling against its reins. Cade instantly pulled the aura back, burying the Lycan-level apocalypse deep beneath his ribs once again. He looked down at the weeping boy, his jaw clenching with a silent, lethal promise. The Alpha trials had officially begun, but Lord Draken had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his own death warrant by looking at the stable boy's prints. The Frost Peak courtyard had transformed from a militaristic training ground into a chaotic, suffocating theater of posturing alphas, preening nobles, and terrified servants. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, horse sweat, and the heavy, aggressive pheromones of rival warlords, all attempting to assert their dominance over the same territory. At the center of it all stood Lord Draken, his massive frame draped in expensive black furs, accepting the subservient bows of the Frost Peak dignitaries as if he already wore the crown. Up on the sweeping stone terrace, Queen Morana turned abruptly toward the grand staircase, desperate to reach the courtyard. Her maternal instincts were screaming at her to physically shield her son from the toxic, venomous display happening below. But before she could take 3 steps, the heavy, ornate doors of the upper council chambers swung open. 3 ancient, deeply conservative elders, draped in heavy ceremonial robes, stepped out and deliberately blocked her path. "Your Majesty," the lead elder, a withered man named Torais, intoned with a sickly sweet bow that did not reach his cold eyes. "You cannot descend yet." The ceremonial greeting dictates that the Queen must observe the arrivals from the high terrace until the final horn is blown. To rush down now would signal a desperate, weak monarchy to our guests. Morana's jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ground together. "My son is in that courtyard, Torais," she hissed, her ice-blue eyes flashing with a terrifying, deeply suppressed alpha fire, surrounded by men who view him as an obstacle. "Prince Fenrin must learn to navigate the reality of his station," Torais replied smoothly, his tone laced with a patronizing edge that made Morana want to draw her blade. "If he is to be a part of this pack's future, he cannot hide behind his mother's skirts forever. The Alpha candidates must see that you respect the traditions, Morana. Do not cause a diplomatic incident before the trials have even begun." Trapped by the suffocating, archaic laws she had spent 3 years trying to dismantle, Morana was forced to remain on the balcony. She gripped the cold stone balustrade, her eyes scanning the chaotic sea of bodies below, frantically searching for the small, limping silhouette of her son. Down in the bustling courtyard, the reality of the gathering was far more overwhelming than it appeared from above. Fenrin had remained safely in the shadows of the stables for as long as his 8-year-old curiosity would allow. But Lord Draken's cavalry had ridden in on massive, breathtaking destriers, beasts of war bred in the Ashen Valley, larger and more terrifying than any horse bred in the high mountains. Despite the cruel words the warlord had spoken, Fenrin was captivated by the magnificent animals. Cade had retreated slightly deeper into the stable to calm a particularly agitated mare, effectively vanishing into the dark. Believing he was safe within the protective ring of his mother's own guards, Fenrin hobbled out of the stable doorway. He carried a small, carved wooden cup of water he had fetched from the rain barrel, his eyes locked entirely on the massive black warhorse being tethered near the center of the yard. The boy navigated the bustling crowd with practiced care. He knew how to make himself small, slipping past heavily armored knees and sweeping velvet cloaks. His heavy iron brace squeaked and clanked with every step, the sound completely drowned out by the roar of the gathering. He only wanted to get close enough to see the intricate iron plating on the warhorse's saddle. But the Frost Peak courtyard was paved with ancient, uneven cobblestones, shifted and cracked by centuries of brutal winter freezes. Fenrin was looking up, marveling at the sheer size of the beast, when the heavy, iron-shod toe of his right brace caught the jagged edge of a raised stone. The boy's momentum betrayed him. The articulated joint of his brace locked entirely, refusing to bend. With a sharp gasp of surprise, Fenrin pitched violently forward. He threw his hands out to break his fall, completely losing his grip on the wooden cup. The cup tumbled through the air, hitting the cobblestones and shattering. The freezing water splashed violently outward, landing directly across the immaculate, polished black leather boots of Lord Draken. Fenrin hit the hard stone with a painful, heavy thud. his iron brace scraping loudly against the rock. It was as if the entire courtyard had been plunged under water. The deafening roar of the gathering evaporated in less than a second. The music stopped. The murmuring nobles completely froze. Every single eye in the vast courtyard snapped toward the center of the yard, locking onto the massive warlord and the disabled child sprawled in the dirt at his feet. Lord Draken slowly, deliberately looked down at his ruined, water-stained boots. The mask of noble civility he had worn for the elders completely dissolved, instantly replaced by the raw, vile cruelty of a tyrant who had just been handed the perfect excuse to assert his dominance. He looked at the boy struggling to push himself up from the mud. Draken didn't see a child who had tripped. He saw the broken legacy of the woman he intended to subjugate. He saw a physical representation of weakness that deeply offended his brutal worldview. "Filthy, crippled little whelp," Draken snarled, his voice carrying the heavy, suffocating pressure of an alpha intending to crush its prey. Before Fenrin could even get his hands firmly beneath him, Draken lashed out. It wasn't a push. It was a vicious, full-force kick aimed directly at the boy's ribs. The heavy steel toe of Draken's boot connected with a sickening, hollow thud. Fenrin was violently thrown backward, tumbling across the hard cobblestones like a discarded ragdoll. He came to a halt several feet away, curling into a tight, trembling ball as all the breath was violently forced from his tiny lungs. A sharp, agonized cry finally tore from his throat as the pain registered, his small hands clutching his bruised ribs as he wept in the dirt. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the courtyard. The Frostpeak warriors tensed, their hands instinctively dropping to the hilts of their swords. But no one drew a blade. No high-ranking noble stepped forward. The toxic, paralyzing hierarchy of the Alpha trials held them completely captive. To attack a visiting Alpha candidate, especially a warlord as powerful as Draken, was an act of open war. They watched, frozen in cowardly silence, as the child of their queen sobbed in the mud. "Is this the discipline of the Frostpeak?" Draken roared, his voice echoing off the high stone walls as he stepped aggressively toward the weeping child. He reached to his belt and unholstered his riding crop. It was a heavy, brutal instrument woven from thick leather, the tip capped with a jagged piece of solid iron. He whipped it through the air, the sharp crack making the surrounding nobles flinch. "A pack is defined by its strength," Draken preached to the paralyzed crowd, raising the heavy crop high above his head, his eyes burning with absolute malice. "If your widowed queen is too soft to purge this pathetic weakness from her halls, then I will gladly begin the cleansing myself. I will teach this broken thing the respect his mother failed to instill." High above the courtyard, Queen Morana shattered the political paralysis of the balcony. "Fenrin!" she screamed, a raw, world-ending sound of pure maternal terror that ripped from her throat. She violently shoved Elder Torais out of her way, sending the ancient man crashing to the stone floor, and threw herself toward the stairs. But as she ran, the horrific mathematics of the distance crashed over her. She was 50 feet above the courtyard. There were 3 flights of spiraling stone stairs between her and the mud. Even if she threw herself over the balcony, she could not defy gravity fast enough. She was a brilliant tactician, a fierce warrior queen, and she was entirely, devastatingly powerless to save her son. Down in the dirt, Fenrin squeezed his eyes shut, raising his small, trembling arms over his head in a futile attempt to shield his face. Draken sneered, his muscles flexing as he brought the heavy, iron-tipped riding crop slashing downward with enough kinetic force to tear the flesh completely from the boy's bones. The heavy, iron-tipped riding crop slashed downward through the freezing mountain air, carrying enough kinetic force to permanently shatter the fragile bones of the weeping child. The paralyzing silence of the Frostpeak courtyard was complete. No one breathed. No one moved. Except for the shadow in the stables. Cade did not run. To the terrified onlookers, it appeared as though the large, quiet stable boy simply vanished from the dark archway and violently reappeared in the center of the courtyard. He moved with a blinding, impossible speed that defied the heavy, muscular bulk of his frame. just a fraction of a second before the iron tip could connect with Prince Fenrin's ribs. Cade threw his unarmored body entirely over the 8-year-old boy. The heavy leather crop struck Cade's broad back with a sickening, deafening crack. The jagged iron tip instantly tore through his rough linen shirt, biting deeply into the thick muscle and scarred tissue beneath. The brutal kinetic momentum of the blow was enough to bring a seasoned warrior to his knees. Cade did not even flinch. He absorbed the devastating impact as if Draken had struck him with a hollow reed, his massive body forming an impenetrable, unyielding shield of flesh and bone over the disabled prince. Beneath him, Fenrin squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the agony that never came. Instead, he felt the heavy, warm, incredibly safe presence of the stable hand wrapping securely around him. "Keep your eyes closed, little lord," Cade whispered, his low, gravelly voice entirely devoid of pain, vibrating with an eerie, absolute calm. Lord Draken froze, his arms still raised from the follow-through of the strike. He stared at the torn linen and the fresh blood welling on the stable boy's back. For a moment, his brain completely failed to process what had just occurred. According to the sacred, unbreakable hierarchy of the pack, a servant touching a noble, let alone physically interfering with an alpha's discipline, was an unimaginable heresy. It was an automatic sentence of death. When the realization finally hit him, Draken's face contorted into a mask of rabid, unhinged fury. "Insolent filth," Draken roared, his voice cracking with the sheer magnitude of his offended pride. He stepped back, pointing a heavy, leather-gloved finger at Cade, who remained crouched defensively over the child. "You dare touch me. You dare interfere with an alpha's right to cleanse this yard. Guards, take this filthy servant and separate his head from his shoulders." 4 of Draken's elite Ashen Valley guards immediately drew their broadswords, the sharp ringing of steel echoing across the frozen cobblestones. They stepped forward in a tight, lethal half-circle, fully intending to execute the unarmed servant exactly where he knelt. Draken raised his heavy riding crop once again, his eyes burning with absolute, arrogant malice. "I will beat the skin from your bones before they take your head, peasant," he snarled, bringing the iron-tipped weapon down for a second, lethal strike. Cade slowly stood up. He placed himself firmly between the 4 armed guards and the weeping prince. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. He simply looked at Lord Draken, his stormy grey eyes darkening into a terrifying, bottomless abyss. And then the quiet stable boy stopped hiding. For years, Cade had maintained a flawless, suffocating grip on his own biology, burying the massive, god-tier entity inside him beneath layers of careful silence and dirt. He had suppressed his nature so deeply that not even the ancient elders had sensed his true bloodline. But as Draken brought the crop down toward him, Cade released the metaphorical chains. The detonation of his alpha aura was not a roar. It was an apocalyptic, atmospheric collapse. It hit the Frost Peak courtyard with the devastating, tectonic gravity of a falling mountain. The air did not just grow cold, it instantly crystallized, the sheer atmospheric pressure becoming so incredibly dense that the oxygen seemed to completely evaporate from the courtyard. It was a Lycan-level manifestation of pure, unadulterated apex power, an ancient, dormant force that had not been felt in the territories for centuries. The physical effect on the surrounding wolves was catastrophic. The paralyzing dominance did not negotiate. It commanded absolute biological submission. 50 heavily armored Frost Peak warriors instantly dropped to their knees, gasping for breath as their lungs refused to expand against the crushing gravity. The arrogant suitors and rival nobles collapsed against the stone walls, their polished boots scraping frantically against the cobblestones as their inner wolves submitted entirely to the terrifying entity that had just been unleashed. The massive destriers in the yard bowed their heavy heads to the dirt, completely docile. Draken's descending riding crop froze in midair. The arrogant warlord was violently struck by the aura, his own alpha dominance instantly, utterly crushed beneath the god-tier pressure radiating from the man in the torn linen shirt. Draken's breath hitched, a cold, suffocating terror seizing his throat. He realized with a mind-shattering shock that he was not looking at a peasant. He was looking at an apex predator of mythological proportions. Cade moved. He did not fight like a trained soldier. He fought with the absolute, devastating lethality of a primordial force. The 4 elite Ashen Valley guards, fighting the suffocating pressure of his aura, lunged forward with their broadswords. Cade stepped inside the guard of the first warrior with blinding speed, entirely ignoring the steel blade. He struck the man's chest with the heel of his bare palm, releasing a burst of concussive, kinetic momentum that sent the heavy, armored guard flying backward through the air to crash violently into the stone wall of the armory, instantly unconscious. The second and third guards swung simultaneously. Cade ducked beneath the steel arc, sweeping his leg in a devastating, low arc that shattered their stances. As they fell, he gripped them both by the heavy iron collars of their breastplates, utilizing their own momentum to violently smash them together. They dropped to the cobblestones like stones, their armor dented, completely neutralized. The fourth guard dropped his broadsword and attempted to flee, his survival instinct overriding his loyalty. Cade did not even look at him. He let the coward run. The courtyard was a silent, terrifying theater of absolute devastation. Cade slowly turned his focus back to Lord Draken. Draken was trembling, his massive frame shrinking under the apocalyptic weight of Cade's gaze. The warlord's mind was short-circuiting. The world he understood, a world where the strong dominated the weak and the wealthy crushed the poor, had just been violently inverted by a man covered in horse dirt. Driven by cornered, rabid panic, Draken let out a desperate cry and swung the heavy, iron-tipped riding crop directly at Cade's face. Cade didn't dodge. He simply raised his bare hand and caught the jagged iron tip of the weapon mid-strike. The heavy leather strap groaned as Draken threw his entire weight into pulling it free, but Cade's grip was like forged iron. Slowly, deliberately, Cade twisted his wrist. The thick wood and leather of the crop's handle violently splintered and snapped in Draken's hands. Before the warlord could recoil, Cade's hand shot forward, gripping Draken by the throat. He didn't lift the man. He simply applied enough pressure to completely immobilize him, pinning the massive warlord in place. Cade leaned in, his stormy gray eyes glowing with an ancient, lethal fire. "You believe that empathy is a disease," Cade rumbled, his voice echoing off the silent, terrified walls of the stronghold. "You believe that a pack must be cleansed of its vulnerabilities, that a child's broken leg is a sin against your pride." Draken clawed frantically at the hand, crushing his windpipe, his eyes wide with absolute, suffocating terror. "Let us see how you navigate the world without your pride," Cade whispered. Cade released Draken's throat and simultaneously drove his heavy, leather-shod boot directly into the side of Draken's right knee. The sickening, catastrophic crunch of shattering bone echoed through the dead silence of the courtyard. The joint violently buckled, bending inward at a deeply unnatural angle. The heavy steel plating of Draken's expensive boots offered absolutely no protection against the apex kinetic force of the strike. Draken's eyes rolled back in his head as the agonizing shock registered. He collapsed onto the uneven cobblestones, his massive body curling into a trembling, whimpering ball in the mud as he clutched his permanently ruined leg. The arrogant warlord who had sought to purge the pack of its crippled weakness had just been forcefully, brutally introduced to exactly what it felt like to be broken. Cade did not look at the weeping noble. He turned his back on the devastation he had just wrought, his terrifying, suffocating aura pulling back to a manageable gravity. He knelt down in the dirt, entirely ignoring the bleeding laceration on his own back, and gently scooped the trembling, wide-eyed Prince Fenrin into his arms. "I've got you, little lord," Cade murmured, his voice returning to the quiet, gentle rumble he used in the stables. "You're safe now." The entire Frost Peak court, paralyzed on their knees, watched in absolute, mind-shattering awe as the lowest-ranking servant in the kingdom held their prince. having just proven himself to be the most terrifying, unyielding alpha in the known world. The agonizing, pathetic weeping of Lord Draken was the only sound echoing through the frozen, paralyzed expanse of the Frost Peak courtyard. The massive warlord of the Ashen Valley, a man who had built an empire on the ruthless subjugation of the weak, was curled into a trembling, whimpering ball in the mud. He clutched his permanently shattered knee, the heavy steel plating of his expensive boots completely useless against the apex kinetic force that had dismantled him. The irony was absolute and devastating. The tyrant who had demanded the pack be cleansed of its crippled weaknesses was now irrevocably broken, doomed to experience the exact physical vulnerability he had so viciously marked. Surrounding the weeping warlord, the courtyard remained a theater of absolute biological submission. Dozens of heavily armored Frost Peak warriors, rival alpha candidates, and haughty nobles remained firmly on their knees, their faces pressed toward the cold cobblestones. They were entirely captivated by the residual, suffocating gravity of the Lycan-level aura that still hung in the freezing mountain air. None of the powerful suitors dared to raise their eyes. Their own inner wolves were whining in total surrender to the quiet, scarred stable boy who knelt in the dirt, gently cradling the disabled prince. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak doors of the stronghold suddenly burst open. Queen Morana practically tore through the threshold, her white winterfox cloak billowing wildly behind her. She had sprinted down 3 flights of spiraling stone stairs, driven by a blinding, apocalyptic maternal terror. She fully expected to burst into the courtyard and find her precious 8-year-old son bleeding on the stones, his fragile bones shattered by Draken's riding crop. Instead, Morana froze abruptly in the archway, her breath catching in her throat. The scene before her defied every single law of reality and pack hierarchy she had ever known. She saw Draken's elite guards lying unconscious and dented against the armory walls. She saw the arrogant warlord sobbing in the mud. And then she felt it. The heavy, tectonic atmospheric pressure of an ancient, guard-tier alpha presence pressed against her skin. It was a gravity so immense and unyielding it took her breath away, yet it was completely devoid of malice. It was a fiercely protective, impenetrable shield of raw power. Her ice-blue eyes tracked the epicenter of that power to the center of the courtyard. Cade, the lowest-ranking stable hand in her fortress, was kneeling in the dirt. His rough linen shirt was torn entirely open across his broad back, revealing a deep, horrific, violently bleeding laceration from the iron-tipped crop. But he was entirely ignoring his own agonizing wound. He was holding Prince Fenrin securely against his chest. Fenrin was safe. He was crying softly into Cade's shoulder, his small hands gripping the stable boy's torn shirt, but he was completely unharmed. Cade had taken the lethal strike meant for her son. Blasphemy! The shrill, panicked shriek of Elder Torais shattered the reverent silence. The ancient council leader had finally hobbled down the stairs behind the queen, flanked by the rest of the corrupt elders. Torais stepped into the courtyard, his face turning a mottled, furious purple as he absorbed the broken hierarchy before him. A servant had struck a noble. A stable boy had crippled an alpha candidate. To the rigid, traditionalist mind of the elder, it was an unimaginable heresy that threatened to tear their society apart. Treason, Torais shrieked, pointing a shaking, liver-spotted finger directly at Cade. The servant has broken the sacred laws. He has struck a lord of the Ashen Valley. Guards, I command you to rise. Execute this filthy peasant immediately. Strike his head from his shoulders. The Frost Peak guards remained firmly on their knees. They did not touch their swords. They were far more terrified of the quiet man holding the prince than they were of the ancient elder screaming at them. Silence! Morana's voice was not a scream. It was a cold, absolute decree that sliced through the courtyard like a honed steel blade. She did not look at Torais. She did not look at the kneeling suitors. She walked slowly, deliberately across the frozen cobblestones, stepping right past the weeping Lord Draken without offering him a single fraction of a second of her attention. She stopped in front of Cade. The stable boy slowly lifted his head, his stormy grey eyes meeting the ice-blue gaze of the Lunar Queen. The terrifying, Lycan-level gravity radiating from him did not attempt to crush her. Instead, recognizing the fierce, maternal sovereignty of the Queen, the heavy aura seamlessly yielded, wrapping around her like a protective mantle. Morana looked at the deep, bleeding gash on his heavily scarred back. She looked at the absolute, unconditional devotion in his eyes. And then she looked at her son, who felt entirely safe in the arms of a man the world had deemed a peasant. "You threw your body over my blood," Morana whispered, her voice trembling with a profound, overwhelming awe that she had never felt for any warlord or king. "You took the iron meant for my son." "He is a good boy, my queen," Cade replied, his gravelly voice incredibly soft, entirely uncaring of the blood soaking his own clothes. "He did not deserve their cruelty." Morana reached out. Her hands, clad in fine dark leather, gently touched Fenrin's hair, reassuring herself that her child was whole. Then she turned her body, facing Elder Torais, the corrupt council, and the dozens of rival warlords who had come to claim her throne. The political captivity she had endured for 3 years completely shattered, replaced by an unshakable, sovereign clarity. "You demanded I host the Alpha trials," Morana declared, her voice projecting across the silent courtyard, dripping with absolute, lethal contempt. "You told me that Frostpeak required the strength of a true warlord to secure our borders. You paraded these men into my home, praising their heavy armor and their massive armies." She pointed a finger down at Lord Draken, who was still whimpering in the mud. "And yet, when a grown man kicked an 8-year-old disabled child to the cobblestones, when he raised an iron-tipped crop to tear the flesh from my son's bones, every single one of your powerful candidates stood by and watched. Your heavily armored lords froze in cowardly silence. Your traditions demanded that a child be brutalized to satisfy a tyrant's bruised ego." Torais stammered, frantically trying to salvage his political machinations. "My queen, the laws of the gathering," Lord Draken was provoked. "The laws are dead," Morana roared, the fierce, unyielding dominance of the Lunar Queen vibrating through the stone walls. "The Alpha trials are permanently abolished. Lord Draken is hereby banished from this territory. Throw him on the back of his horse and send him back to the Ashen Valley broken, so his people can see exactly what happens to cowards who raise their hands against the vulnerable." She stepped forward, her ice-blue eyes sweeping over the kneeling suitors. "If any of you arrogant lords wish to challenge my decree, draw your swords now. Let us see how long you last against a true alpha." Not a single man moved. The courtyard was completely, utterly subdued by the undeniable truth of her words and the god-tier predator kneeling behind her. Morana turned back to Cade. The quiet stable boy had gently set Fenrin on his feet, supporting the boy's iron brace as he stood. Cade remained on one knee, his head bowed respectfully to the queen, fully expecting to return to the dirt and the shadows now that the danger had passed. He had hidden for years. He had accepted a life of nothingness to escape the violent politics of the world. But Morana was not about to let a guard return to the stables. She did not see a servant covered in horse dirt. She saw a man whose strength was so absolute he didn't need to posture or preen to prove it. She saw a protector who believed that true power was measured by the capacity to shield the weak, not exploit them. She saw the exact king her pack desperately needed, and the exact mate her own fiercely guarded heart had been waiting for. Lunar Queen Morana extended her bare hand toward the bleeding stable boy. It was an unprecedented, tradition-shattering gesture. She was offering the absolute authority of the Frost Peak crown to a man without a name, without an army, and without a single coin to his name. "You have lived in the dirt, Cade," Morana said, her voice softening into a promise of profound, undeniable equality. "But a man willing to bleed for a broken boy does not belong in the shadows. He belongs on a throne. Rise, Alpha, rise and take your place at my side." Cade looked at the Queen's extended hand. He looked at the brilliant, tear-streaked smile of little Prince Fenrin, who was nodding eagerly at him. For the first time in a decade, the massive, suppressed entity inside Cade's chest finally felt like it had found a home. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gripping the Queen's. As Cade rose to his full, towering height, standing shoulder to shoulder with the fierce Lunar Queen, the entire kingdom of Frostpeak fundamentally shifted. The era of arrogant warlords and toxic traditionalists was permanently over. The pack would now be ruled by a brilliantly tactical queen and a guard-tier Lycan king who had proven once and for all that the most terrifying weapon in the world was not a broadsword, but a father's unconditional devotion. But what do you think? Did Lord Draken get exactly what he deserved for his arrogant cruelty and for laying a hand on a disabled child? How would you react if the quietest, lowest-ranking servant in your house stepped up and revealed himself to be a guard-tier Lycan alpha to protect your family? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this epic tale of dark fantasy romance, hidden identities, and a deeply satisfying role reversal where the toxic villain gets completely dismantled by a true protector, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow shifter romance fans. And if you want to hear more stories where true power couples tear down the archaic, toxic traditions of their packs to protect the ones they love, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next epic tale.